Hi, welcome to our lecture on muscles. In this chapter, we're actually going to take a look at real muscles, and we're going to figure out how they're attached and how they work. Now, we're going to begin here with this idea of attachments. Of course, we have an origin, which is our generally stable attachment. In this case, you can see that on the temporalis muscle, this origin is high. And we have an insertion, the attachment end that is likely to move during muscle contraction. In this case, the insertion is down here lower than the origin. And that tells us a lot about what's going to happen here. We have what's referred to as the action, which is the movement that the muscle produces. And it's going to be a combination of the joint, and we have, of course, our hinge joint here of our temporomandibular joint, allowing for us to elevate the mandible as we pull that insertion towards that origin. So we always want to think about what would happen if we were to bring that insertion towards the origin. In this case, it would be elevation of the mandible. Now, one of the issues we have as we begin this chapter is that we're going to have muscles to learn all over the body, and we can break them up into distinct units. One of the units we're not really going to be talking in detail about is the muscles of facial expression. And we do want to recognize this is kind of a general mammalian characteristic that is obviously very important in humans, so that we can actually use our facial expression to communicate with others. As you can see by looking at this image, though, there are a lot of facial muscles, and they are really weird. They might be attached to other muscles. They might be attached to the underside of the skin. They are likely, but not always, attached to bone at some point. So it's kind of a really weird set of muscles, and it would require kind of an additional time of study for us to investigate these, so we're not going to. What we are going to do is investigate a couple of them, and then we're going to take a look at other muscles of the face, and in this particular lecture, muscles that work, say, the abdomen and other areas associated with respiration. So let's begin here with the orbicularis oris. The orbicularis oris originates on the maxilla and mandible. It inserts on the lips, and we can think about that as being the underside of the skin. And we can see that this is going to form a ring around the mouth here. Obviously, to see a muscle that inserts on the skin, you're going to have to remove the skin, so you won't really see what it's inserting on. If we want to think about what this is going to do, though, looks like a ring around the mouth, and it's going to compress that. So it's going to compress the lips or purse the lips. It's going to cause you to kind of do that kind of fish face where you push your lips out from your mouth. And again, this is kind of a muscle of facial expression, so you can use facial expressions from this, but it also helps us to manipulate our lips during the process of eating. Okay, we can think about this as transitioning into things like preparing to kiss. So the orbicularis oris might be used for that purpose. The orbicularis oculi seems to share a name with it. Now, if we actually break this name down, we can see why they are sharing part of it and why part of it is different. So orbicularis means that the muscle is circular. And again here, if we take a look, we have a circular muscle. Again, largely inserting on the skin, in this case around the eyelids, and the origin is actually here, high and low on the medial side of the orbit. So it kind of circles around here. Now, this one, oculi, means eye, whereas oris meant mouth. So the orbicularis is the same. Oculi and oris are where these two differ, telling us about their location. So the action of this one will be to close the eye, just as the orbicularis oris would close the mouth. This can lead to blinking, winking, and squinting. And I often just like to think about linking these two muscles together because they do share part of their name. They are similar in shape. You might wink using your orbicularis oculi in the hopes of catching the attention of someone you would later like to kiss using your orbicularis oris. Now we're going to have a couple of muscles of mastication, mastication being chewing, and we're going to be focusing on the kind of most intense part of the chewing, that is the elevation of the mandible. So we have two muscles that elevate the mandible. The temporalis muscle here originates in the temporal fossa. You might also find sources that refer to superior and inferior temporal lines, and it inserts on the coronoid process of the mandible. Obviously, it's not going to insert back here on the joint, although we do have a smaller muscle which inserts on that joint to pull it forward for protraction. We're not going to be learning that muscle. So in this case, we are going to be elevating the mandible. as we pull that coronoid process up towards the temporal fossa. Our other muscle of mastication is the masseter. The masseter we can see going across here. It is missing part of its origin, so we can see it here on the posterior part of the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic arch has been cut away, but this white tissue here, this tendon, would be attached up to other portions of that zygomatic arch. The insertion is on this lateral side of the mandible, what we refer to as the ramus, which is this branch that goes up and down. You can see it goes here to the angle of the mandible. It's really attached to this lateral side of the mandible as opposed to actually just hooking to that angle, and that's why we don't tend to use angle of the mandible. We would actually have to scrape muscle off of all of this surface to remove that muscle. Now the action of this one again is just to elevate the mandible. So as we're thinking about the temporalis and the masseter, we want to think about how this relates to all of the learning of muscles we're going to be doing throughout this chapter. They share an action, and we're going to have muscles that share actions, which we refer to as synergists. And we're going to want to learn these muscles which are synergists together. That is, that we will group our synergists. So we're going to say, hey, I have two things that elevate the mandible. I know I can learn those two together. What I can't do is use their action to discriminate between the two of them because they do the exact same thing. So I need to figure out how do they differ. In the case of the masseter and the temporalis, that's actually really easy. The masseter, of course, is going to originate on the zygomatic arch, and the temporalis originates on the temporal fossa, and we see temporal in the name of both the muscle and that origin. So we're always going to try to figure out not only how do I group muscles together, but what information do I need to tell the difference between them? All right, here we have a muscle of the neck known as the sternocleidomastoid, and it actually has a really cool, if annoyingly long name. Now, when we do learn names like this, I think it's really important that you say them a lot and that you write them a lot to make sure you can get them down. This one has multiple syllables, sternocleidomastoid. Each of those things that I just said, each piece of it was actually 2 syllables. It's a 6-syllable word. So we want to make sure we get each of those pieces. Now, as far as origins, it originates low. It inserts high. The origin is kind of a couple of different things. It's on the manubrium as well as the medial side of the clavicle, so you can kind of grab that area with your hand by putting it across your sternum. You're going to be kind of dealing with the origins of both of your sternocleidomastoid muscles, the left and the right. And the insertion is the mastoid process, which is the bump we're going to feel if we reach up underneath our ear on either side, so just posterior to our ear, but also underneath. And if we think about pulling that mastoid process down towards our manubrium, we can figure out that action. So this particular muscle, because it does have the ability to pivot, it's going to be working with a joint that allows rotation, is going to have a unilateral action and a bilateral action. The unilateral action means what happens when we contract one of these. So if I were to contract only my right sternocleidomastoid, I would look to the left. That is, I'm pulling my right mastoid process towards my sternum. But if I were to contract both sides at the same time, I'm going to flex my neck and head. And the reason why I'm saying flexing both the neck and the head is I'm going to flex the head against the atlas. And I'm also going to flex those intervertebral joints. So I am getting flexion occurring at both of those, but I will pull my chin down towards my manubrium. Now here we can see a little bit different view of this, which will show off the two heads of the sternocleidomastoid. So we can see here that we have this head that's on the manubrium, that's the sternal head, and we have the clavicular head, the part where it gets the name cleido. And they of course join together. That's what two heads do. They are kind of separated attachments that will join as they head towards that insertion. Our next muscle is the diaphragm. The diaphragm we've already introduced as separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, but it is a muscle of respiration, and so we are going to recognize that we do have certain muscles that help us breathe. We'll learn some of them, but not all of them. This one has a very complicated origin. It's on the xiphoid process. It's on some of our costal cartilages and ribs as it circles around, and you kind of get the idea that we can follow this shape right in here. And it even has some straps that go down to the lumbar vertebrae. We can't really see them, but they'd be attached down in this area here. And its insertion is what's referred to as the central tendon. So it's kind of like it's attached all around the outside, and it's going to pull against the very middle of it. So if we were to look at the middle of the diaphragm, it would mostly be this white tendinous material. And the action of this is to pull that central tendon inferiorly. You can see that the diaphragm here is shaped kind of like a dome. It's high in the middle, low on the sides. And we're going to pull that central tendon down, which will expand the thoracic cavity, increasing the volume of our lungs, which will decrease their pressure. Therefore, that's going to cause air to enter our lungs, and we refer to that as inhaling. So the action of the diaphragm is to help us inhale, if we want to think about that in a simple way. Here we can see the diaphragm from below. We can see some of those straps that are attached to the lumbar vertebrae, and we can see that central tendon quite nicely. We can also see some of the issues with the diaphragm. If it's going to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, it has to allow things to pass through it. So the inferior vena cava will pass through this caval opening. We have the esophageal opening or esophageal hiatus, which will allow the passage of the esophagus, and we also need to have an aortic opening or hiatus to allow the passageway of the aorta as it goes from being the thoracic aorta above the diaphragm to being the abdominal aorta down below the diaphragm. We do have a couple of other muscles that are going to be used for respiration. The intercostals, they come in external and internal forms, and their origin and insertion are really kind of weird because they are so similar to each other, but are also exactly the opposite of each other. So let's kind of try to figure out what I'm saying there. The origin of the external intercostals, which are going to be superficial to the internals, is going to be the inferior border of a superior rib. So if we find rib number 1 here, the origin of the externals is here on the bottom edge of rib number 1. And we see the muscles come down and attach at their insertion to the superior border of this inferior rib. That would be rib number 2 in this case. So we're bridging the gap between ribs number 1 and 2. Now there is something weird going on with these intercostals. I can see the internal intercostals here. And we've suggested that these externals, based on their name, are superficial, the internals are deep. Well, the externals don't go into this interchondral area between the costal cartilages, so you can see the internals superficially within that area. If I wanted to see more of the internals, I would actually have to cut away this external and look underneath them. Now the action of this, of course, is going to be to pull that lower rib up towards that higher rib. And this is going to elevate the ribs. As the ribs are elevated, they are also pulled kind of away from the body. And you can imagine this as having a handle on a bucket. As you pull that bucket handle up, it also swings outwards. This will all increase the thoracic size, the volume of the thoracic cavity, which will lead to inspiration. And we happen to refer to this as active inspiration because this is something that we don't do on a normal basis when we are doing our normal breathing. That's going to be covered by the diaphragm. But when we need more air, let's say that I've been sprinting and I'm super tired and kind of just chugging air because I've used up all my oxygen, that would be active inspiration. We'll actually see that there are certain conditions, things like emphysema, which will cause people to use these all the time, and they will develop what we refer to as barrel chest because they are constantly using these intercostal muscles to help them breathe, and that leads to an increase in musculature and an enlargement of this chest area. Now here we have our internal intercostals, obviously the same image. We're just looking deep to the externals, or we're looking medially. The origin is the opposite of what it was before. This is now the superior border of the inferior rib, and the insertion, the inferior border of the superior rib. So if we go to this same intercostal space here between rib number 1 and rib number 2, our origin is going to be here on the superior border of the inferior rib, rib number 2, including the costal cartilage. And we're going to travel upwards right here, and in this case we're going to be going towards the inferior border of rib number 1. So we're going to do the opposite action as well. particularly in the interosseous portion. We're going to depress the ribs. That is, we're going to take and we're going to use rib number 2 to basically kind of pull on rib number 1. And we're going to pull all these ribs downwards, and you can kind of forcefully exhale and feel your rib cage get pulled down and in. So this is going to be used for active expiration. Think about blowing out the candles on a birthday cake. Not that we usually think about doing that in COVID times, but if we're blowing out candles, that we're going to be forcefully pushing air out, more air than we would get out in a normal breath. And that means we're employing our internal intercostals. All right, that moves us into the abdominal muscles. The abdominal muscles can be quite complex. We're going to have a big muscle running up and down in the middle. We can't see that here because of something we refer to as the rectus sheath. And on the side, we're going to have 3 layers of muscle. So we're going to have our external abdominal obliques on the outside. Underneath those, or deep to them, will be the internal abdominal obliques. And deep to those will be the transversus abdominis. Now, each of these is going to be a little bit different. Beginning here, we have the external oblique originating high on ribs 5 through 12 and inserting down low on multiple things. Things like the iliac crest, which would be under here, and the linea alba, this white band that goes up and down here through the middle. And I know you might be saying, well, I don't see how that gets there because the muscles, shown in purple here, are way over to the side. But they're going to use this, what we call rectus sheath, as a tendon to attach to the middle. What that allows is for the external on one side to pull against the external on the other side. Now, the action of this is actually quite complex. It can compress the abdominal wall by having these two pull against each other, like the diaphragm pulled against the central tendon. It can flex the vertebral column, which is going to cause you to kind of bend over as if you're trying to touch your toes. But what's kind of specific about the obliques, because they do run diagonally as suggested by their name, is that they're going to cause rotation of the trunk. In this case, it's going to be rotation to the opposite side. So if we use our left external oblique, we're going to actually turn our body to the right. Okay, so we want to kind of think about how that's going to work. And you can imagine that if I'm pulling here with my right external oblique, I've got my origin up here, my insertion here, and as I contract that right external oblique, I'm essentially going to have to move, in this case, what we commonly refer to as that origin if my feet are planted. And what I'm going to do is pull that rib cage over towards that kind of central point. Now we do have an internal abdominal oblique, which is going to look kind of the same. You can see the external is gone. We've removed what we call the superficial layer of the rectus sheath and can now see the rectus abdominis. We can see that linea alba, that line that goes up and down in the middle a little bit more clearly here. And we can see that we have a layer of muscles beginning down low here and running diagonally towards the midline as they go up. We want to remember that our externals started high and they ran diagonally down towards the midline. So these things are running perpendicular to each other. The origin of the internal oblique is kind of complicated. The simplest part of this is the thoracolumbar fascia, and we'll take a look at that in a second. And then, of course, the inguinal ligament and iliac crest. Inguinal ligament going between the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle, and the iliac crest being somewhere over in this area. The insertion is the linea alba, but also the pubic crest, some of our ribs, and this is going to be the underside of our ribs and costal cartilages. So for the most part, the origin is low, the insertion is high. And if we think about how this will work, again, we could potentially pull against the two sides to compress the abdominal wall. We can flex our vertebral column, but we can rotate the trunk to the same side. So what we're going to try to do in this case is take our origin here and then pull this insertion here towards that, and that's going to cause us to pull with my right internal to the right side. Deep to that, we have the transversus abdominis, and this one should look a little bit different than the others. The others ran obliquely. That was a diagonal grain to the musculature, and this one seems to run from side to side, from medial to lateral or lateral to medial, depending on how you want to look at it. In this case, the origin again is the thoracolumbar fascia, which will be on the back. Obviously, lumbar suggests it would be. The inguinal ligament, the iliac crest, all of that is shared with the internal oblique, but it's also going to originate on the costal cartilages or ribs, numbers 6 through 12. What that's really telling us, which is kind of important, as is the insertion of the linea alba and the pubic crest, is that the origin, while being around the back, is kind of high to low. When we thought about the external obliques had a high origin. The internal obliques had a low origin. The transversus has high and low, but towards the back, very lateral. And the insertion is medial, going through this connective tissue, which is the deep layer of the rectus sheath, to the linea alba, which is straight down the midline of this, and it includes this pubic crest down below here. So we've got an insertion which is also high to low, and the action of this isn't really going to be about flexing the vertebral column. It's not really going to be about rotating the trunk as it was for the obliques, but it's going to be about compressing the abdominal wall. This is the one which is most like the diaphragm, in that the left side is going to pull against the right side, and we're going to put tension on this area in here to flatten this out. So when you're doing something like sucking in your stomach, that's going to be this transversus abdominis. And this can be beneficial to us for a variety of reasons. If I pull in and kind of push using my transversus abdominis, I can make myself pee a little bit faster. I can put some pressure on for some defecation if I happen to have a uterus, which I don't, and it happens to be going through contractions because I'm in labor, which I'm not. I could use this, in this case, to kind of forcefully help with that uterus. The uterus, of course, doing involuntary contractions. Now here we want to take a look at this thoracolumbar fascia, or thoracolumbar aponeurosis. So this is a origin for many of our muscles, and it's this band of white tissue here, predominantly in the lumbar and lower thoracic regions along the back. This is actually kind of a shortcut for us when we say that something like, say, the latissimus dorsi here attaches to the thoracolumbar fascia, because what that means is it's attached to the spinous processes of some of our thoracic vertebrae, spinous processes of our lumbar vertebrae, possibly to what we call the median sacral crest, which is the spinous processes of the sacrum, and then this posterior part of the iliac crest, which we can see quite nicely here in this image. So it's attached to all of that stuff. In other words, it's a very kind of sturdy, strong attachment. It's also along the back here. And that takes us to kind of that last action of the transversus abdominis, which was to tense the thoracolumbar fascia. And we can make more sense out of that looking at this image here. Imagine you are flexed. Let's imagine that there's a box on the floor, and you're bending your back to reach down to pick up that box. As you start to extend your spine to straighten up, the first muscle that should contract is going to be your transversus abdominis. And it's going to pull here and here deep to this latissimus dorsi and pull on either side of this thoracolumbar fascia to put tension along your spine so your spine doesn't waver side to side. But people have found through studies that if you've injured your back, that muscle doesn't tend to fire first, and therefore you actually are more prone to hurting your back again because of a back injury, meaning you should probably go see your physical therapist and train your back to work properly again, and or learn ways to avoid putting that strain on it in the first place. So our last abdominal muscle is the rectus abdominis. Rectus means straight in this case. So if we think about all of our abdominal muscles, we have two that are oblique or diagonal, one that is transversus, meaning it runs transversely or across, and rectus, meaning straight up and down. We have an origin on the superior portion of the pubis. We have an insertion up here high on the xiphoid process and adjacent costal cartilages. We can see the linea alba separating the right and left rectus abdominis muscles. And the action of this is kind of the easiest and most obvious. This is going to flex the vertebral column. It does contribute to some extent in compressing the abdominal wall, but the muscle that really nails that is the transversus abdominis. This is the one that's really about just flexing the vertebral column without any of that rotation that we get from our obliques. Now, of course, we can also see the tendinous inscriptions going across through different sections of this, which lead us to call this our six-pack, although obviously you can see there are actually more than 6 individual chunks. The 6 here are kind of the ones that will tend to pop out and be that six-pack. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of the features we were talking about here, the rectus sheath and the linea alba. The rectus sheath is the fibrous aponeurosis of the obliques as well as the transversus abdominis. It does tend to come in a couple of layers, one that is on top of the rectus abdominis, one that is deep to it. The superficial one is the insertion tendon for the external obliques, and the internal obliques and transversus abdominis use the deep layer of this. So this does enclose that rectus abdominis, that's why we call it the rectus sheath, but it allows those muscles on the side to attach to that linea alba in the center. And that is just this longitudinal collagen band that runs up and down here, basically between the xiphoid process and the pubis. And that's going to be used here as an attachment for all of these abdominal muscles except for the rectus abdominis. That is simply divided by it. But all the ones on the side, both obliques and the transversus, attach to the linea alba. Now we can see on this cadaver a little bit better of an idea of what's going on with these abdominal muscles, in that those that are lateral, those can be seen as 3 separate layers. So we have here the external abdominal oblique, the internal abdominal oblique, and the transversus abdominis. 3 different layers. And you get the idea that the externals are on the outside of the rib cage, these internals kind of attach to the bottom of the ribs, and the transversus are definitely deep to the rib cage. And here we can see those nicely again, just to get another good view of how all these things attach and to take a look at their origins and insertions. So when we think about the external, the origin is high. I like to put my hands on the kind of lateral side of my ribs and run them down towards my pubis to get an idea of the grain of this muscle as it goes down and medial towards that insertion. To do the internals, I start opposite. I feel my anterior part of my iliac crest, and I run my hands up until I hit my rib cage, noting that they are running medially as they're running superiorly. So I go from an origin that is lateral and low to an insertion that is medial and high. And then for the transversus, of course, we reach around the back and we circle around towards the front. So I can go ahead and think about, I don't know if anybody's a Green Bay Packers fan, but kind of making that championship belt as you come around from the back towards the front, just like Aaron Rodgers. That would be, in this case, how we would recognize the grain of musculature for the transversus abdominis. All right, so quadratus lumborum. This is a weird muscle to talk about. It's in the same region as the abdominal muscles, but the abdominal muscles are all on the anterior side. The reason why this one is included here is because if we think about what those abdominal muscles do, other than to a certain extent the transversus abdominis, they are going to flex the vertebral column. That is, cause us to bend forward. Well, this muscle here we can see is located posteriorly. So we've got an origin on the iliac crest, and this iliolumbar ligament, which goes across to the transverse process of the 5th lumbar vertebra. The muscle goes up towards its insertion on the 12th rib, and it's going to attach as well to these transverse processes of the other lumbar vertebrae as it does that. Here we can see that in a cadaver going between that iliac crest and that 12th rib. So obviously, if we go through the abdomen, it's deep to all of our intestines. It ends up that there are going to be muscles on the back that make this hard to see from the posterior view as well. But when we can look at this, we can see probably what it's going to do. Unilateral action is particularly easy. We take a rib, we pull it down towards that posterior iliac crest. It causes us to bend to the side. That's lateral flexion of the spine. So it will laterally flex the spine if we use just one of these. If we use both of these and we are already flexed, it will extend our vertebral column. So it's an antagonist to most of our abdominal muscles. Now, it does something else that's kind of really crazy. It fixes a floating rib during forced exhalation. Forced exhalation, breathing out, like blowing out those candles on a birthday cake, was an example of what we would do using our internal intercostals. the internal intercostals need to pull the ribs down. And if you think about that, how can the 12th rib connect to a muscle that can pull the 11th rib down when both of those are floating ribs and they're free to move around? To make that whole system work, you need to pull down on that 12th rib. Fixing it just means you hold it still so it can't move up. That will allow the intercostal going between the 12th rib and 11th rib to contract and pull that 11th rib down, which will obviously hold still that 11th rib so that the muscle going between it and the 10th rib can pull that 10th rib down. So those internal intercostals work because the quadratus lumborum contracts to hold that 12th rib still. So the reason why this muscle is included right here is it's an antagonist to our abdominal muscles, but it's also used with our respiratory muscles. Now, as far as the rest of the back, it's kind of a mess. So we can see some quadratus lumborum here, and if we look on this left side, we can't see that quadratus lumborum. And that's because we have all kinds of other muscles, the erector spinae group here, which are going to be covering that, muscles like the serratus posterior inferior and serratus posterior superior. So we have got muscles running up and down our spine and muscles connecting our spine to our rib cage. And it essentially is a very thick section of muscles, particularly down here in the lumbar region where we have these larger muscles. So it's a little bit more than we want in this class. I do want you to be aware that you're going to want to take a look at muscles like the multifidus, like the iliocostalis, the longissimus, the spinalis, if you end up going into physical therapy, because of course these muscles, which are going to be largely antagonistic to our abdominal muscles, are often some of the things that people may need to strengthen in order to get their body back into working order.